مرحبا جميعاً، أنا رولا أسد صحفية وباحثة نسوية.
Hello everyone, I'm Rula Asad. I'm a journalist, a writer, and I'm an environmental activist. We will be talking today about women's strategies for climate justice in the MENA region after COVID, post-COVID. This talk is being hosted by FES. We will give the floor first to Mrs. Zainab Haidli, who will be explaining more about these events, the series of events and the objectives behind them. Thank you. I will be speaking in English.
في interpretation للعربي وللإنجليش أو للفرنش sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to our fourth online discussion of our series of online discussions on feminist strategies for a gender-just new normal. My name is Zainab Haidli, and I'm the program manager for the Regional Political Feminism program at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Just to give a few words on FES. So FES is the oldest political foundation in Germany with a rich tradition in social democracy dating back to its foundation in 1925. The foundation owes its formation and its mission to the political legacy of its namesake, Friedrich Ebert, the first democratically elected German president. And the work of our political foundation focuses on the core ideas and values of social democracy, freedom, justice, and solidarity, which very much align with the demands of the feminist movement. The Regional Political Feminism program was established in Beirut in 2018. We work with our feminist partners and women's rights activists on advancing gender justice advocacy at the regional level, mainstreaming intersectional feminist principles and approaches with a focus on feminist economics and repoliticizing feminist movements and activism across the region. We just launched our new website, which is available in Arabic, English, and in French, and where we share the feminist knowledge we produce and provide training opportunities. And I will share the link to our website in the chat in a bit. So as I said at the beginning, our online session today is part of a series of discussions on a post-COVID feminist agenda. And through this series, we aim to build on the lessons learned from the pandemic to discuss and present feminist strategies for tackling some of the most pressing issues that we're currently facing in the region and around the world. We therefore invite feminists and activists from the region to discuss relevant topics and provide their input on the way forward and on how we can imagine the new normal from a feminist lens. Our first discussion was focused on feminist strategies for addressing gender-based violence in the MENA region. Our second was on economic recovery, and the third discussion was on digital justice in the MENA region. You may watch the sessions if you're interested on our Facebook page, and I will share the link shortly in the chat. I will hand over back to Ola so she can share with us more details on today's session and introduce our panelists. And before closing, I just want to say that we hope through this webinar to provide a platform for reflections and for discussion. And we also hope to be able to provide key takeaways that you can then carry with you and implement in your work. Thank you.
شكرا زينة وشكرا لفتح هيدي المساحة.
Thank you, Zaina. Thank you for giving us this space to discuss all these important topics in the region. I will start by giving some logistical information. We will be mainly using Arabic for the session. We'll have only one intervention in English, but besides that, everything will be in Arabic. You can listen to the interpretation into Arabic, into English, or into French by clicking on the right channel, and you can check the chat for that. This session is recorded and will be broadcasted on Facebook. I would like to ask you to write down your comments, your questions, and write down everything you can think about regarding today's session in the chat box. If you have any technical problem, please write to us in the chat box or text Jana directly. You can see her name in the list of hosts and panelists. Let's start with today's topic. We cannot but say in the beginning that we've been witnessing many climate changes in the world, many climate events, extreme weathers, floods, high temperatures. But the most important thing today is not only the environmental part, but how can we think of the environment based on a feminist lens. Many studies have stressed on climate justice, social justice, and feminist justice. Oxfam, ActionAid, the UN, and many other agencies have stressed that women and girls are the ones that are the most vulnerable to different climate changes and extreme weathers. And of course, these all cannot be predicted or unpredicted. Environment and climate affect women and girls more than others. Why women? Why girls? It is very important to talk about women's perspectives and feminist perspectives because women are among the poorest in the world. The 7 among the 10 persons that are the poorest in the world are women. I will be very brief. I will try as much as possible not to talk much. I will go through different environmental catastrophes and disasters in the region before delving into further details. In Iraq, for example, there are many climate changes, drought, desertification, and the poor water resources in Lebanon, which was one of the richest countries in water, has been affected by climate change recently. Of course, there is the problem related to waste in Lebanon, in Syria, and Yemen, and in Sudan, in Libya. There are conflicts, wars, and weaponization. We will be talking about the relationship between the weapons, the wars, conflicts, and the feminist perspective, the feminist lens, and the climate impact. I will be concluding by giving some examples from Egypt. In Egypt, there are many protests related to the use of water, use of lands, to as well many other environmental problems. In Tunisia as well, there is an environmental problem. The aim is to stress on how we can look at all these topics based on a feminist lens. We have many experts with us today, and I will be all ears, and I cannot wait to listen to everything they have to say about that topic. We have first Mrs. Sarin Karajerjian from the environmental politics program in ARI, the Arab Reform Initiative. Before that, she used to work in IFI, the Islam Faris Institute in AUB, at the AUB University. She is a holder of a master's degree in environmental planning policy, and she has as well a master's from the AUB. We in Beirut, we have Lina Abu Habib, head of Al Asfari Institute for Citizenship in AUB. She teaches and writes about gender, about citizenship in the MENA region. And she writes about gender rights, about economic rights and care work. She is a member of النوع الاجتماعي والتنمية Gender and Development magazine, and she is a member of the Fund for Women and many other funds. Lina has an expertise in working with international organizations, regional organizations, and with universities, local communities, the media, and she has a long expertise in different fields, mainly related to mainstreaming gender in different programs and the policies, development policies and programs. We will start directly with a discussion. We'll give the floor first to Sareen. She will be speaking in English first. You have 10 minutes, Sareen, before we give the floor to Lina and open the floor for discussion and comments, of course. Sareen, the floor is yours. Thank you, Rula. I would like to thank Friedrich Ebert for this invitation. I'm extremely happy to be with you today. I'm happy to be here with my dear friend and colleague, Lina Abu Habib. I will start with English before shifting to Arabic.
the gender inequalities and the patriarchal system that we face in our region. Then the impacts of war, since today we're talking about women being at the center, the impacts of war on the environment and how the wars affect women specifically, as well as, conclude with the more ecofeminist movements that we are witnessing in the region. So at the core of the gender inequality is a global patriarchal system that manifests itself differently, depending on the country and the region. However, it always has the characteristics of limiting women's agency over their own life and decisions. In other words, denying them economic, educational, and social opportunities to develop new professional and academic skills. Hence, it is much more difficult for women to adapt when faced with a social or economic transition brought by environmental factors. For example, in low-income women working in agriculture, they are specifically due to a lack of educational and training opportunities, are less likely to have a diverse set of skills, meaning they are at higher risk of being left behind as climate change renders their job impossible to complete. Similarly, as well as we have seen, because of a lack of other professional opportunities, women often play the key role in unpaid household management and domestic economy. And we've seen this during the pandemic, meaning they are particularly affected by natural disasters, such as floods or landslides, as they find themselves responsible, for example, of household recovery, often in the immediate aftermath of the disaster. An example, and Rula, you've mentioned, the pollution and the drought that we have seen and witnessed in the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers. This is making life very difficult for women, for specifically communities that have for millennia made a livelihood from these rivers. In northern Syria, also witnessing war, women working in the field of agriculture have found themselves jobless following a massive drought, which has left them particularly vulnerable to famine and domestic abuse. And as we know, agriculture is one of the major employers in the Middle East region. An estimated of 60% of agriculture of women, workers are women. And more specifically, if we look at Iraq, 49% of women living in Iraq are employed in the agricultural sector. So what does it mean for the Middle East? Which includes some of the countries that are the most vulnerable to climate change. Again, going back to Iraq, which has also seen its environment destroyed by war, foreign occupation, and bad governance. As Iraq becomes increasingly hot, as we've seen in the summer, and less arable, its security situation will further deteriorate as the state will find itself unable to serve the people's basic needs. And in the midst of a political conflict and environmental collapse, millions of Iraqis will be forced into exile in neighboring countries, simultaneously becoming climate and war refugees, as the latest International Red Cross publication has shown. Again, looking back at conflicts in other parts of the Arab region, conflicts in Sudan and Syria have been directly linked to environmental factors and particularly to climate change. Access to urgent reproductive care becomes very restricted. Children are forced to interrupt school to go work in often unsafe jobs to support their families. And many young girls are forced into early marriage. Additionally, also during wars, women are subject to kidnapping, trafficking, sexual slavery. Soldiers and militiamen are notoriously prone to assaulting and harassing women, taking advantage of their perceived vulnerability. And we've seen this instances of rape being used as a weapon of war were recorded in Libya, as well as in Syria. Refugee camps in Lebanon and in Jordan have been witnessing women as many sources of violence. around 30% of women in Syrian refugee camps in Lebanon and in Jordan have reported being victims of some sort of violence. So patriarchy have created a movement in the benefit of capitalism. And in the context of wars and conflict, women's bodies and girls specifically are used, and as we said before, as weapons of war over controlling resources which are patriarchal values. So I'd like to talk about feminism, which is not a new concept to the world, but also to the region, and which argues actually that misogyny and environmental destruction have the same root cause, a masculine desire to dominate and own what they perceive to be beneath them. And patriarchy here has played a major role in the degradation of the environment. So looking back at, the Arab feminist movements in the region, which has a long and very rich history with countless of activists, thinkers, intellectuals, and writers leaving their marks on the environment. Arab feminists have been at the forefront of most social movements against repressive regimes that have relied on patriarchal models or modes of production to sustain themselves. And Arab feminists have embraced positions related to intersectionality, ecofeminism, in order to advance their own agenda and introduce it in their parties. I mean, we can give specific examples and where Arab women have paid a very heavy price for their engagement, not just on women's rights, on human rights, but also on environmental protection and preservation, such as Razan Zaitouni, Smira Khalil in Syria, who have disappeared and they were never elucidated. In Egypt and Tunisia, women activists have been at the forefront of the 2011 revolution, and specific organizations have been created, such as the Coalition of Egyptian Feminist Organization, have made a great deal to bridge the gap between environmental, political, and gender causes. Other examples as well of intersectional and ecofeminist organizations that explore this nexus between the patriarchy, homophobia, and environment degradation. We've seen it, with the Qaus in Palestine, the Shuf organization in Tunisia, and the Yemeni feminist network movement in Yemen, and others as well. So why is it important today to talk about coalitions and joining forces? And what can we learn as environmental groups from the feminist movement? That there is a core essential issue that is joining forces and recognizing that environmental movement does not exist in silos, and they are not part, and they should be part of other movements in the region. We've organized an event as part of the Arab Reform Initiative annual conference last June on just transition. And while we're talking about just transition, we also discussed about the feminist approaches and including all different actors at the decision-making table. And oftentimes women are not at the table of decision-making powers. And our own Farah Daibes, who was actually with us in the audience from Friedrich Ebert, was one of the speakers. So we should recognize that there is a feminist principles and approaches that should be used, such as solidarity movements and coalitions. And this is also how, at the moment, we're seeing this in preparation for the conference of parties that will happen at the end of the year in Sharm el-Sheikh, that there is a need and an urge and a major need to engage more and build alliances and coalitions. And what we like to call it within the Arab Reform Initiative is this community of practice of scholars and activists that think together, that speak as a one voice, which we are different, but we should share the knowledge and be able to support each other. So to conclude, and then we'll open up to different discussions, and change do take time, and it's often very difficult. How do you build and forge alliances and coalitions over a long period of time? And how do you actually continue on creating an open dialogue among local and regional feminist groups, but also environmental groups that are part of these feminist groups? And here I'd like to quote Lina Abu Habib's latest piece in the Gender and Development, that collective work is very important. And if there is one thing that we have learned from this pandemic is that it's global. we cannot just think about local, it's a global, it affects globally. But again, the effect of it is interpreted differently at the local level. So looking at collective work, one, knowledge production and dissemination are key tools for activists and lobbyists to exchange information, learn from our unique shared experiences, and support each other. And we're seeing this a lot, women being harassed, whether on the streets here during the solid waste crisis. We've seen this as well in Iraq, women being harassed because, using their body, sexual harassment, but also intimidation, because they are part of the movement or on the Hirak al-Madani. So support each other and effectively plan and strategize to be able to enact a long-term agenda from the region with a more South-South collaboration. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا إليك سارين وبكل تأكيد.
Thank you, Sareen. Yes, this environmental topic is trans-sectoral, is cross-border, and we cannot work in silos, as you said. Thank you again. I would like to ask all the participants to write down their comments, their questions, and the Q&A or in the chat box. We will have a discussion later on, of course, after the second intervention. Lina, the floor is yours now. We cannot wait to listen to your viewpoint about the topic. Hello, Rula. Thank you. Thank you, Sareen, as well. I'm extremely happy that I am participating to this call with you. Thank you, Zena. Thank you, FES, for this initiative. What is very important here is that during the past period, we've all been discussing these topics together. I have 4 comments that I will be formulating, and I will be complementing what Sareen just said. Regarding, first, the holistic approach, regarding the formation of the different organizations and different movements, the transformational and transitional movements in the region, and what about climate justice and the feminist movement. After that, I will be talking about the patriarchal regime. I will be giving some comments, and I will link that to the extractive industry we've been talking a lot about recently. So we've been witnessing this extractive industry even from women, and I will tell you what I mean later on. Another thing regarding the solutions that are being presented now, the solutions that differ between different groups and different people. Some solutions are imposed on people, but not everyone abides by these solutions. I will talk about the gender perspective here, and I will be talking at the end about some of the women's or the feminists' contributions. Rula, please interrupt me or give me a sign when my time is almost up. Regarding the social movements, we know that there are many social movements that have seen the light recently, transformational movements. Some of them have been seized by dictatorships, by oppressive regimes. Others were able to preserve their independence, autonomy, and sustainability. I will take here some of the examples. What are the groups that have gathered historically and recently, and what are these groups that were able to form social movements? If we were to talk about human rights movements and then environmental movements, people living with disabilities movements, and feminist movements. And here I'm not talking about trade unions or syndicates, because we know that in our regions, these syndicates and trade unions have been hijacked, if we could say so. And I'm talking here about the traditional, of course, trade unions and not the alternative ones. Two problems. If we put aside feminist social movements, all other movements in their majority, and even if I'm generalizing, the majority of these movements are patriarchal movements par excellence, as we say. No matter how much they say that they are modernist and progressive and progressist, these movements are led by men. They have these patriarchal practices. They are marginalizing women, including the protests that have seen the light recently in our region and the environmental movements in our region. If I were to think about why is this feminist work regarding climate justice not as highlighted as other types of activism, such as, for example, the activism and the feminism work related to violence, I would say that women did not have enough agency, and up until recently, there were no feminist lens regarding these environmental topics, and there were no links between environmental themes, environmental issues, and other issues. Some were stressing only on reforestation, for example, as part of a solution to the climate change, but this is not true. We cannot work like that in silos. We need a holistic approach towards that. We need to analyze the ecosystem if we truly want to understand how things are going. Recently, the majority of movements that pretended to be progressive or modernist are not feminist. They are alienating and marginalizing girls and women, but are alienating as well other vulnerable groups and mainly and many other main groups, if I could say so. I feel sometimes that I cannot see the difference between many of these movements and the regimes themselves in the modus operandi. There are many similar ways of working, if we could say so, between these movements that pretend to be progressive and between the regimes. Another thing, so far, what we've been listening to, what we've been hearing in terms of solutions, all the solutions related to changing the way of life, the consumption, or the use of certain causes. Changing the consumption patterns. These are only asked from the most vulnerable, from the poorest, those that had nothing to do with the crisis itself, but the crisis was imposed on them, and they are asked to change their way of living. They are asked not to have many kids, not to use water, not to use electricity. While other wealthier groups did not change their way of life. No one talked about their carbon footprint, although they had a huge carbon footprint with their activities. They had built missiles and many developed resources and tools, and no one told them anything, but the poorest are asked to do these concessions. The current Minister of Social Affairs, who was a dentist, said that one of the solutions to limit consumption is for women to use pads that can be reused, so washed and reused instead of thrown away, if I could say so. I'm giving this example so that you know how things are going here. Sometimes we do not pay attention to the extent of which this patriarchal pattern is stressing a lot and putting a lot of burden on the shoulders of the poorest. And this is the pattern that is leading to the development of public policies. Therefore, we should be honest with ourselves. These solutions related to different lifestyles, to different consumption patterns, and even if we all do that, we won't be able to solve the crisis or the problem. And in general, women, girls, displaced women, displaced girls, domestic workers are the ones that have to abide by these rules, but not others. This is true injustice. Another thing, this patriarchal, feminist, extractive way of thinking. I will not be delving into many details, but I can say that the foundation of these crises is the injustice and inequality in terms of who is extracting resources, who is using the resources, who is benefiting from the resources. And of course, not the most vulnerable and not the most marginalized, not the women, not the girls. Not women, not girls are the one benefiting from these resources. Regarding extractivism and this extractive pattern, all the economic patterns we've been witnessing are extractivist, if I could say so. They are extracting all the power from women. Women are obliged to work in care work, to work at home, and they are not remunerated. Women are vulnerable, are marginalized, are sometimes suffering from violence. And if they're not, they work in non-remunerated labor or job. So there's this imbalance in this power. We're asking a lot from women. We're extracting their resources, their capacities, their time, and we're giving them nothing in return. We're not involving them in decision making. So, can there be sustainable, just solutions without taking into account how we are extracting the resources, capacities, skills, and time of women? Just because they're women, just because they're supposed to do everything they're doing and assume all the responsibilities they are assuming. One last observation. What can we do? Last year, during the CSW Commission on the Status of Women, held partially in New York, and the main topic discussed back then was climate justice and gender justice. We've talked a lot about that with Farah from FES, Hadil from Oxfam, and we've noticed that the participation of feminist movements from the region, mainly the older generation, so my generation and the generations before me, so their participation was quite inexistent. So there is a link between climate justice, gender justice, and we know that it is important to discuss that intersectionality. It is important to stress on this patriarchal approach that is taking advantage of women's resources, these patterns that are extracting all women's resources and skills and time. And women are not involved in decision making. Women are not involved and not around the table, if I could say so. Rula was talking about that before. We noticed that interest is put elsewhere. Interest is found more among the rising organizations, the rising movements that are succeeding in working on different topics together, all together, and not in silos. For many reasons, and I will not be delving into these details, we are trying as much as possible to be proactive, to discuss all these topics, mainly based on a feminist lens. Even when we talk about feminist economy, about care work, social production, we tried to be proactive. We started thinking about that years ago. This applies as well to climate justice and the relationship between climate justice and gender justice. I will give here some examples. Hadil, the colleagues from Oxfam, Farah from FES, and all the others, in addition to me, are all working. We are all working on producing knowledge, local knowledge mainly. We don't mind learning from social movements from other regions, but the main thing for us is to produce local knowledge about these topics. Another thing, the aim is to get to know more about the different spaces for advocacy. What are the advocacy spaces given to or available to women and to feminists, to feminist movements? We feel that there is a huge gap, and we're trying, along others, to bridge this gap, producing local knowledge, creating spaces for feminists, working on intersectionality, creating spaces for young women to be able to work together, and networking with other spaces, mainly advocacy spaces at the international level. How can we do that at a time where our region is becoming more and more oppressive? I think this is the true challenge we are facing. I think that the majority of feminist movements, mainly young feminist movements, which in my opinion are developing a lot, in light of a very difficult situation, in light of the patriarchal violence that is becoming harder and harder. I don't know if this wave is becoming stronger, if I could say so, because they're afraid patriarchy is ending. But anyway, I hope so. Anyway, we cannot but talk about climate justice and gender justice altogether. So we need to talk about the benefits, about the finances, about extractivism, about who is benefiting from the resources, how resources are being extracted, what about women's wealth, women's resources and skills, and who is benefiting from these resources and skills. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I took too long. Not at all. Thank you, Lina. Thank you for paving the way for the discussion. Thank you for this analysis. Sorry. I would like to ask you not only to write comments, but rather ask clear questions in the Q&A or in the comment or in the chat box. I will give the floor first to those who wrote their questions in the chat box. Please, ladies, feel free to answer. Jihad from Egypt talked about the importance of working practically on the ground. and the importance of working practically on the ground. We were talking about the importance of networking, of promoting the sharing of experience and expertise between different movements in the region. As Lena was saying, in the region, we're talking more about the regional contexts. It's not only about being vegan, about buying this, not buying that, about having an electric car, not another kind of cars. It's not only about that, it's about finding drastic climate environmental solutions. Back to the regional links. How can you promote regional links? How can you promote networking as well? Thank you, Rola. And thank you, Dina. If we were to build coalitions, we are witnessing many coalitions being formed, and this starts with Lebanon. We've seen, for example, how we had a coalition regarding solid waste, which is a topic that is quite difficult to handle. It's quite difficult to change the patterns that are prevailing ever since the 1990s. It's quite difficult to change the behavior. So, yes, practically on the ground, there were coalitions aimed at working on the solid waste management issue. Many organizations, many associations, many volunteers from the civil society worked on the ground and worked with media outlets. This was not easy at all. It was very important for us to work with media outlets so that we have media outlets on our side, so that media outlets broadcast our voice and voice our concerns. And back then, it wasn't only about harassment, but about verbal, about physical pressure that many activists on the ground have been subject to, have been victims of. We've seen that in Lebanon, in Iraq, and elsewhere. I think that networking, building alliances are very important. This is essential to our work. When we talk about justice, about environmental justice, climate justice, we should directly think about building coalitions, about working together. How can we do that? In ARI, in the Arab Reform Initiative, we've been trying to create that space for advocacy, this advocacy space. The aim would be to develop studies from the region and not only have agendas imposed by foreign countries and implemented here. So it is very important to produce knowledge, to produce research here in the region. It is very important to have experts and researchers, young men and women from the region, work on these studies and researches. It is very important as well to see where we should lobby, where should we do our advocacy. Exert pressure on whom and how. Regarding climate change, we've been witnessing many trends last year in preparation of the Sharm el Sheikh conference. Greenpeace, for example, is organizing a camp in Tunisia, and in September, more than 300 young men and women from the region, many advocates, many activists will gather so that we can all, as organizations, as associations, as universities, as NGOs, as CSOs, mainly from the South, have one agenda, one common agenda. We will be thinking about building coalitions, building partnerships, about bridging different gaps. It is very important for us to work together, to share experience and expertise, and to bridge each other's gaps. The COP, the Conference of Parties that will be held in November in Sharm el Sheikh and next year in the UAE, should help us build on this momentum. We are at a crossroads. CSOs, organizations that can play a major role, should do it now. In Egypt, this might be difficult now, but anyway, there will be a space for us to build on that momentum. We have been seeing as well many movements in Bisri in 2017, 2018, 2019. There was a coalition formed, the Lebanese Eco Movement was formed they did an advocacy campaign regarding the Bisri Dam. They did not want for the dam to be built. They amplified their voice. They spoke the same language, if I could say so. They used resources and tools available in order to have a greater impact on decision making and on public policies. And this is a very important example from the region. Sarine, you've answered many questions about networking, building alliances. I guess that Lena has something to add. Regarding building alliances, two persons, if I'm not mistaken, talked about that. The COP that will be held in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. As feminist movements, we cannot count a lot on that COP, and we cannot expect a lot. Why? Because of the venue, because of the country the conference is being held in. We know who will be attending, who won't be attending. I think that the participants will be more critical about these topics. Mainly feminist, intersectional, inclusive movements. These won't have their place, won't have their voice, especially women, Egyptian movements. So I don't think we can count on this COP. As it looks like right now, we can't expect a lot from that COP. But what are the alternatives to alliances? It's not only about South-South partnerships or alliances or coalitions. Yes, South-South coalitions and alliances are very important, but it is very important to open up to more, to broader alliances, global alliances. We have been facing many challenges. One of these challenges is related to the white feminism. This is prevalent in larger spaces, but we should look for entry points for networking opportunities. The CSW, which we all work under, and we all know the mechanism of the CSW, and we see that some patriarchal regimes are still influencing this meeting. What can we say about the COP meetings then? So what I'm trying to say is that we need to find entry points through our alliances. We need to break glass ceilings and to find innovative ideas to solve these problems. You are right. It is very important to see if there's any kind of whitewashing, for example, happening, if the country where conferences are held helps or not. Some are asking about alternative feminist movements. I guess that we've listened to an experience from Egypt about how eco-friendly paths started being used. Yusuf from Morocco talked about environmental justice and about gender mainstreaming. These are all comments, and thank you for your comments. I don't know if Lena can talk about more examples and resources from this movement, from this region. I always forget to unmute myself, unfortunately. Briefly, let me tell you about period poverty. So regarding period poverty, technically, scientifically, We all know what the alternative is. We all know that cups, pads that are reusable and that can be washed are alternatives. But allow me here to give an example. A feminist organization, and I would like to ask Riham to post the link to that organization, Jayitna, or we have our period in English. So this is the transliteration or the translation of the Jayitna website. Anyway, we're asking poor women to use the alternatives. But what's the problem here? Yes, technically, cups may be the best solution. This use of cups requires defying the different patriarchal regimes. We should all know and raise awareness about the fact that the period is not something satanic between two brackets. It's not about not being able to touch anything if we have our period. In addition to that, we need water, we need private spaces, we need different utilities that can help women find alternatives or better alternatives. So scientifically, we know what are the solutions, but these are not available to the poorest. It's not about finding an alternative to what is bad by finding something that is environmental friendly but not accessible to women. So what I'm trying to say is that some ideas that are scientifically proven are not practical for women. Some blame it on women. Your pads are polluting the country or the world. Our minister talked about using, for example, reusable diapers for children, washable diapers instead of using these one-time use diapers. We're asking them to buy electric cars, but we forget that these are costly. Who can afford electric cars? We tend to forget as well that electric cars might be polluting as well. So this is why it's not only about finding alternatives or finding solutions, but rather finding solutions adapted to the context and convenient solutions. Regarding the frameworks and the tools to be used, we already talked about that, and I'm going to repeat it. Working together, working together, working together. I cannot stress on the importance of that enough. These spaces that we are sharing now, the experience we're sharing, the knowledge we are sharing, are all extremely important. This is an added value from a no issue to an issue discussed every week on a weekly basis as feminists. This is very important. As feminists, we have a certain familiarity with the mechanisms that are currently in place. So we are not very familiar sometimes with some mechanisms. And here I will be giving the floor perhaps to Riham, because she can be more eloquent than me, if I could say so, about that. Anyway, this should be a part of our path as feminists. We should be able to link different topics together and not work in silos. So we need to delve deep into different spaces, to participate in the different spaces, to invade the spaces that can help us share our knowledge, our experience. Another thing, producing local knowledge, very important. We need to work in order for us to be able to produce our own own local knowledge. This will help us find our orientation. This will help us influence decision making or raise our voice against the half solutions, if I could say so, that are presented. Thank you. Yusuf talked about the national plans of different Arab countries regarding climate justice and having a gender dimension. Are there any studies or reports regarding that? So, if we know if the national plans of Arab countries are talking about the gender perspective, are these influenced by social society? What is the role of civil society in advocacy? And my question is the following. Many oppressive regimes and many first ladies, for example, such as Asma al-Assad in Syria, have taken advantage of many environmental organizations and movements. Our First Lady said Mrs. Nia does the same. We see women and the First Lady wearing Louis Vuitton and planting trees somewhere in the country. But this is not the solution. So we've talked about the necessity of finding alternatives. We've talked about the role not only of the country, of the state, but the role of the civil society. Sareen first and Lina as well. I think that now we're delving deeper in the alternatives in the consumption pattern, the role of the states, the role of civil society organizations. How are the fundings being used or misused? Rula, back to the ministries. The Ministry of Environment, how it started working in our Arab countries. Starting the 1990s, Arab countries were obliged to have ministries of climate or environment because there was the Rio summit held back then, and there were certain agendas to be implemented. The Ministry of Environment in different countries plays the role of an NGO, if I could say so. The Ministry of Environment waits for the funding from abroad. Projects are implemented, the programs are implemented, and this is how things go, and this is how the Ministry of Environment works. And in ARI, we've written a lot about that. In Egypt as well, there's the projectization of the Ministry of Environment, a project funding another project, a third project, a fourth project, but who is accountable, who is taking advantage of that, who are the beneficiaries of different large projects funded, whether in terms of energy, of food, of water. And when we talk to activists on the ground, we notice that they tell us that they have many weapons, but we have many weapons, sorry, but we have nothing to eat. No energy consumption, no sovereignty, no food sovereignty, no energy sovereignty, no sovereignty over natural resources. So this is what the activists are complaining about. So a lot of weapons that are available, but very few resources that can be used. This applies as well to other topics. There are sometimes international agreements between, let's say, Tunisia and Germany. And regarding green hydrogen, we've been having similar and seeing similar agreements. The Ministry of Environment is not always present on the platform, unfortunately. Who is responsible? Who is accountable? What about governance? Who is responsible for environment and environmental issues in the region? What is the role of civil societies? Back to what we were saying and back to your question about civil society organizations. Yes, we've been witnessing movements, activism regarding these topics in the region. But we tend to think about these topics technically. Let us find a technical, scientific problem to a political solution, to a political problem. We wanted in ARI to talk about environmental policies, and we know that in English policies and politics are the same and different at the same time. Anyway, environmental politics and environment politics. We need to find not only technical solutions to political problems. In Tunisia, for example, in 2020, there was a huge scandal, if I'm not mistaken, and the Minister of Environment had to resign from his position because of the waste coming from Italy that were thrown towards the south of the country, the southern part of the country. Back to inequality. Why do we see some regions with water, others that lack water? Why do we see, for example, garbage being collected in this region, not in that region? So these are political decisions, not scientific, and require political decisions, not scientific solutions. Lena? In the framework of the feminist work, there was a generation that was extremely convinced that we could do reforms from the inside. The regime is not homogeneous, and we can find entry points. After 30 years of work, we've noticed that no, this cannot happen. This is not feasible. We cannot change the patriarchal regime from the inside by discussing this topic and that topic, by opening up their minds to new things. It is as if we're seeing a violent man beating his wife, and we try to convince him not to do that. So it's not really about that. We've been trying these strategies for quite some time. We've spared no efforts, no resources, no time in doing that, but this is not the solution. Not really. It is very difficult when you have a corrupt, patriarchal, oppressive regime. So with this regime, it is not logical to say, yes, but the ministries or the ministers of environment are good and we can work with them. Trust me, Rula, we've been trying that for quite some time. Patriarchal regimes, the corrupt, oppressive patterns are infiltrated everywhere. We can find patriarchal ways of thinking everywhere, infiltrated in different institutions. So I think activism is important. Civil society is very important. I know that the civil society is not homogeneous and progressive, but activism should be initiated outside the regime, outside the system. Activism should be efficient. The modus operandi should be different than the modus operandi of the regime. So sharing experience between different movements from the region, change from within or from the outside. Sometimes we think that we're having tactical solutions, but in fact, this is draining resources, skills. This is leading to attacks launched against many feminists, mainly feminists that had tried to work with the different regimes on change progressively. We still have 20 minutes approximately. We will give the floor now for 10 more minutes for the comments and questions before talking about the recommendations. I have a question that we can ask from a feminist perspective. What are the economic and political reforms that are urgent now? This might be a heavy question, a difficult question. Now we talk about the red lines, about the entire world, all the governments and all the people knowing about these red lines. But it is important to remind of the urgent economic and financial reforms.
لكن رح أقول ركز بمنطقتنا بسبب التقارب الجغرافي، تشابه المصائب إلى آخره. بتحبي تبلشي سارين بهذا الخصوص؟
اوكي. طبعا يعني اذا بنفكر
سارين, if we were to think about the economy, we find solutions in a way or in another. So let us come and solve our problems, but we tend to forget that the system itself is corrupt. How can we benefit from our economy? If now, for example, now we're talking about the COP that will be held. We see that Egypt is talking about the funding coming from abroad, about the reforms. Yes, but practically on the ground, who is going to benefit from these projects? What about the civil society? What about CSOs? What about local communities? What role will local communities play in these projects if we have the same corrupt people managing the funds received? I can give an example. There was an environmental movement that started in the 80s. Habib Malouf talked a lot about this movement, and in ARI, we've published a lot of articles about that. We talk about development. We want to become better, yes, but we tend to forget that preserving the environment requires as well preserving the economy. We cannot build a hospital or say that we will build a hospital but the entire system, the entire regime is corrupt, who are benefiting from the projects, from the funding. So what is the role of local communities who is benefiting from the project, from the funding? Can we say that local community members have their voice in the discussion? Are they involved in the decision-making process? Are they around the table or not? What about municipalities, for example? Are municipalities involved? Will they be involved in different projects? But I can say that our municipalities as well are drowning in this game of political polarization. I think that among the recommendations, we should stress on the reuse of our resources, use the resources in a way that truly benefits the local communities. Local communities should be able to say, no, we do not this project because this is not a green project, or we do not want this project because this project does not suit us. In Palestine, for example, many women stood against the solar panels project that was going to be implemented. So yes, solar panels might be good, but we're under occupation and we have many other needs besides that. So in Tunisia and Morocco, we've been seeing many similar movements as well. Thank you, Sareen. And thank you for talking about these examples, about this greenwashing we've been seeing by the occupation. Lina, we're talking about the climate or environmental justice and about the feminist approach. We've been talking about countries at war, but countries at peace as well. It is very important to find that link between women's rights and climate justice. Someone asked this question, and I think that we should talk about this link, the link between women's rights and climate justice. We were participating in another webinar with Hadil and other colleagues And I will tell you about an example that we had mentioned. Before talking about climate justice, as feminists, when asked about armed conflicts and about the relationship between armed conflicts and gender equality, they used to tell us there is no relationship between the two, that wars are affecting everyone. You feminists like to complicate things, etc. Although things were clear about how conflicts and wars affect women more than others. There is no catastrophe, no problem, no activism, no activity that has the same impact on everyone, because not everyone is similar and not everyone is in the same position. And the relationship between people on the one hand and these topics on the other hand are not equal. So we start from we come from spaces witnessing a lot of injustice, a lot of problems. Let's talk, for example, about the refugees, the displaced, the LGBTQ plus community that are affected in ways different to others. So we have differences that make us affected differently by the same problem. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic did not affect all people the same way. Some people were dying, but 2, 3 rich people were able to travel to the moon. Anyway, not everyone was affected the same time, the same way, by the pandemic, and not everyone is affected the same way by different problems. What are the reasons of climate injustice? This is related mainly to regimes capitalist, brutal regimes that are benefiting an elite and that are marginalizing the majority. These elites are benefiting from the resources or exploiting the resources at the expense of others. So we're starting from unequal grounds. Second, this system, this patriarchal regime, is founded on women, on girls that have a non-remunerated care work. Social reproduction is obligatory, if I could say so, for women and girls, unpaid, and not valued at all. Social policies, civil, personal status laws, customs, traditions, everything makes it even worse. This is why when we, for example, have scarcity of water in a certain region, in a certain country, it would be up to women to find alternatives. Whenever there are, let's say, diseases or infections in certain regions, it is up to women to help sustain the family, to help sustain the community. So the burden is mainly on the shoulders of women. And this is the main key that would help us understand everything. Whenever there's a catastrophe, a crisis, who is mainly concerned in finding a solution? Women and girls. We say that men solve all problems, but practically on the ground, based on the living experiences of people, this is not how things go. It is up to women to find alternatives. They are the number one groups or group affected by any change, by any crisis. Exactly like conflicts and wars, they are affected more than others, but they're not involved in decision making. I hope that I made my point. Yes, thank you. Sareen, do you have anything else to add about the link between climate change and women's rights?
يعني وخاصة بهالجلسة اللي هو كتير من أول حرف إنه عم نحاول نفكفك شو بنقصد فيه مشان ما يكون مثل ما قالت لينا.
We're trying here to deconstruct that topic. We're feminists, yes, we're feminists, yes, but we're not trying to complicate things. Regarding climate justice, we can learn a lot from women activists, from the feminists, from the experts that came before us. Collective work is very important. We cannot work alone. We cannot work in silos. We are an environmental group. We are a feminist group, and we each work separately from the other. We cannot do that. We need to build alliances, coalitions help activists on the ground. Alliances help us have a greater impact, mainly influence decision making, public policies. But we should have a legitimacy. Where does that legitimacy comes from? Does that legitimacy come from? This comes from our minds, from our intellectual property, from our own skills and resources, from our experts. So, at the same time, we always say that we need to create spaces, common spaces, to work on joint studies and research, to amplify our voices, to raise our voices. And here we are back to the power. We're back to the power of collective work. It's very important to work together, to work in alliance, and not separately from one another. Lina, you have something to add, I guess. This what I'm going to talk about is a patriarchal mentality, of course, and we've all heard that. For example, someone might tell you, what does poverty have to do with gender? And here you feel that you want to beat yourself over it. Anyway, what does education have to do with gender? I don't know. I think that this is a part of our responsibility. We might have not communicated positively enough. We might have not clarified the issues clearly enough. So we might not have used the right strategies to work together, to communicate, to showcase our topics. But the patriarchal mentality is doing no effort, is doing nothing to understand more about what we're talking about. We were not born feminists. We had to review different experiences. We had to relive different situations. We had comparative studies. We talked, we discussed. We compared different situations before we became where we are now. The feminist intersectional activism that is sparing no effort nowadays can lead by example. Let's think together, work together, read something. Let's see how all these are intertwined. Yes, of course, all these topics are intertwined, and it is up to the feminists to do the sensitization and the outreach. We will be concluding the discussion for the day. We have many comments, many information in the chat box. Please, if there is any link that you would like to save it. Jihad had asked a question. This session will be posted on FES website. There are as well other publications mentioned by Lina, by Sareen, and other publications from Al-Asfari Institute. All these links were posted in the chat. And I think that Riham from the Asfari Institute had posted many links. So the resources are here, yes, but you need to look at the chat here. in Algeria, taking care of the environment is at the heart of all social dialogues. And there was another question that will lead us to the end of our discussion. If there were recommendations that you would share, what kind of recommendations, what kind of practical solutions would you present? I'm not asking you to give false hopes to anyone, but rather present some recommendations. Sareen? Thank you, Rula. Thank you, Lina. I would like to thank all the participants, all the attendees. Thank you for your comments, for your questions, for interaction. I hope that we will be able to stay in touch. Regarding the campaigns that are being organized, Noura, you can join the camp organized in Tunisia, and as Ari, we will be present before the COP, and we will be drawing alliances with different youth groups from the region. And what's happening is extremely important. This is something that we hadn't seen before in this part of the country. Regarding my recommendations, governance first. Who is responsible for what? Who is responsible for the problems we've been witnessing, environmental problems we've been witnessing? So who will be responsible? Who will be accountable? Collective work as well. I encourage collective work a lot. It is very important to be able to think together, to have a common impact, to have an agenda from the region. This extractivist theory, sending our resources to Europe, this brain drain, all these problems we've been encountering and how we can help solve these problems. So working collectively on all that is very important. As Ari, we've been organizing many events related to the fair transition. We cannot talk today about climate change, about environment, if we do not have social justice, if we do not think about the just transition, the fair transition. What about local communities? How can we use our resources, water resources, food resources, energy resources in the best way possible? How can we have a sound discourse? How can we have our own way of thinking towards the just transition in the region?
اوكي اذا انا بس بسرعه زميلتي ريهام حطت links.
Riham posted the links in the chat box.
تنضم إلى مباشرة.
You can directly join two events. First, the training session that will be held in Beirut and online, mainly a training session about climate justice and gender justice in cooperation with Oxfam, with Hadil. And second, a think tank, Hadil posted that in the chat. It is about thinking together about how we can work together. At least start thinking about how we can network, how we can work together. I would like to ask Riham to post the link in the chat box so that all those who are interested can communicate with her. And I will be posting my link too in the chat box. Now, there are not only recommendations, but actions, collective actions aimed at producing knowledge in the region that looks like the region, that is suitable to the region. We have a critical thinking as well towards different solutions presented by our governments that are sometimes empty solutions. In a report I read 2 days ago while preparing for this seminar, for this webinar, I read the sentence, women are not only victims of climate change, they play a major role in adaptation and the reusing of resources and managing the natural resources. Women have always had the solutions to all the problems during that period, and after everything that happened, we can say that women are victims exactly like men. But yes, women are suffering from intersectional and intersectoral kinds of oppressions. But women are creative, innovative. They can always find a way to find the right solutions. Women have the main role of keeping their families alive, of taking care of their household. I would like to thank Sarine and Lena. Thank you for your presence. Thank you for your contribution. Thank you, Rula. I would like to thank Friedrich Ebert as well, because they're sharing their resources with us, and they're using their resources at the right moment, at the right place. Thank you for giving us this opportunity. I was Rula Asad. I'm Rula Asad, the moderator of that